Now that I've delivered the Emperor's decision, we can move on to the barter trade of mana stones. Once that is settled, we'll address other matters, Lanesra said. Immediately, holographic displays appeared in front of each Astral Conclave representative. Each display was visible only to the individual it was intended for and showed the total amount of mana stones prepared for their civilization, matching the previously agreed quota. The representatives began entering the details of the materials they had brought for barter. The displays instantly updated, with the number of mana stones fluctuating based on the quantity and quality of the materials offered, showing them precisely how many stones they could receive in exchange. Ha 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 ha. The Zelvora representative's laughter echoed through the mental network, drawing the attention of everyone connected to him as they glanced at the hologram visible within the network. What is it, sir? One of the individuals in the mental link asked, curious about the reason for his outburst. We're essentially getting these mana stones for free, he replied smugly, his gaze fixed on the list of materials he had entered for exchange. They've stumbled upon one of the most valuable resources in the galaxy, have it in abundance, and are trading it for basic goods that are practically worthless, he added with a tone of disbelief. This is the curse of ignorance, diving into trade with counterparts without fully understanding their value system or the worth of their resources. He still couldn't wrap his head around it. They were about to acquire an enormous amount of mana stones, resources that would normally require intense bidding and competition among civilizations to obtain. Yet now, within mere hours, they were poised to receive 100 times what they could normally acquire in a year, for less than a tenth of their usual expenditure. The sheer thought of it left him reveling in their good fortune. Unfortunately, it won't be long before they realize this and raise their prices, another individual in the mental network remarked, his voice tinged with slight disappointment at the thought of losing such an advantageous opportunity. Yes, but how quickly they discover or gain that knowledge depends entirely on us, the representative responded, his tone calm and calculated. If we take care to hide this effectively, we can stretch this advantage for a long time. By then, we'll have accumulated enough reserves to weather any protests or trouble they might cause before we settle things and resume trading with them. As he spoke, he completed inputting the materials for his exchange, the system approving the entry and leaving only the final step, the actual transaction. His confidence was clear, underpinned by the belief that their foresight and subtlety would ensure their continued gain. They're not going to declare war, another individual within the mental network said, his tone calm but carrying a hint of disappointment. With the mana stones we'll have in our possession, we'll be able to bring a much larger number of fleets compared to the previous time. Besides, they can't completely stop selling mana stones for long. They're bound by the mana oath to continue selling to us, and their friendly relations with the Astral Conclave hinge on that condition. If they break the agreement, it would leave them exposed. No restrictions would protect them from the actions of the Conclave's members, and all the Conclave rules related to their empire would be suspended until they fulfill their side of the deal. That alone should be enough of a deterrent to keep their retaliation in check. The moment they break the agreement, we could refuse to return to it and instead demand a new one that's even more favorable to us, he added, though his voice betrayed a sense of resignation. He realized that the Empire would likely not take any drastic measures, which meant his civilization, and the Conclave as a whole, would probably never get the chance to seize the mana-rich star system outright. Their gains would remain limited to purchasing cheap mana stones instead of fully owning or controlling part of the star system, a prospect he found less satisfying. But the timeline depends entirely on how long it takes them to decrypt the Trinarians' knowledge and make use of the technology within it, the advisor who had accompanied them pointed out, his voice measured but cautious. If the Trinarians buckle under the pressure of seeing other civilizations increase their quotas while they can't until they hand over the decryption keys, it would give the Empire a clear path to accessing that knowledge. Once they do, they could finally have the means to enter the Conclave more easily and gain access to the information we're exploiting. There's also the risk that one of the civilizations might reveal this information to the Empire in exchange for favorable terms, he continued. This could include an increase in their mana stone quota, maintaining the current low prices, or even as a way to break the Empire's retaliation of withholding quota increases for those who provided encrypted knowledge. Some might even use it as an opportunity to get closer to the Empire, seeing it as a chance to strengthen ties. His words caused the mental network to fall into an uneasy silence, as everyone reflected on the precarious situation. While keeping the knowledge secret was beneficial to all the civilizations involved, it was clear that not everyone would act in unison. The potential to exploit this knowledge as leverage with the Empire could tempt one civilization to betray the rest. By doing so, they could gain significant benefits for themselves while simultaneously disadvantaging their rivals, an opportunity too enticing for some to ignore. It was the inherent flaw of an organization like the Conclave, where a lack of centralized leadership left each member vying for personal advantage while striving to keep others in check. Call for a meeting immediately after this one is done, the Zelvora representative finally said, breaking the heavy silence in the mental network. He had devised a potential solution and wanted to present it to the other representatives. If his plan failed, however, he was prepared to resort to the worst of the available options. His tone carried the weight of the stakes at hand, and the urgency of his decision was clear to everyone listening. Once all the representatives had entered their offered goods for exchange into the hologram, the room fell silent once again. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation as everyone awaited Lainsra's cue to proceed. At this moment, she effectively presided over the meeting, given that the Terran Empire was the sole supplier of mana stones and the central focus of the trade, placing her in an unchallenged leadership role. Now, let's move to. Lainsra began, only to be interrupted. Excuse me, the Zelvora representative interjected abruptly, cutting her off just as she was transitioning to the next agenda item. Lainsra turned her gaze toward the Zelvora representative, her eyebrow raised in a mixture of curiosity and mild irritation. She questioned whether his interruption was prompted by something genuinely important or simply an attempt to undermine her authority in the meeting. It was nearly impossible to determine his true intent, as the Empire still lacked sufficient data to fully decipher the motivations behind each civilization's actions. This knowledge gap often forced Imperial officials, tasked with managing these alien interactions, to operate with limited foresight, piecing things together as they unfolded. What is it, Mr. Calron? She asked, her tone even but laced with a hint of curiosity. I propose we take a short break to complete the actual exchange of mana stones before reconvening to address the remaining items on today's agenda, Calron, the Zelvora Royal representative, suggested. His expression betrayed his eagerness to finally lay eyes on the mana stones. Their presence already was enough to subtly enhance the ambient mana, making everyone feel as though they were enveloped in a soothing, invisible massage. His suggestion for mana exchange looked to have clearly struck a chord with many in the room, as several representatives nodded in agreement, their own eagerness to obtain the mana stones mirroring his. Lainsra observed the eager expressions of the representatives in the room and took a moment to collect herself before speaking. It seems everyone is quite impatient to see the mana stones. Therefore, we will take a one-day pause in the meeting to allow the exchange to proceed and to ensure both sides can verify that the agreed amounts are transferred as stipulated. Her tone remained neutral, but inwardly, she felt a sense of satisfaction. Their strategy was unfolding as planned. Securing the mana stone exchanges before discussing any potential quota increases would create pressure on those who had provided encrypted knowledge. This pause would give them more time to deliberate with their respective leadership, potentially forcing them to decide whether to release the decryption keys or risk losing the advantage as other civilizations moved ahead. Thank you, Calron said, his expression brimming with apparent excitement. To anyone observing, it seemed as though his happiness stemmed from his eagerness to finally get his hands on the mana stones. With that, the meeting room quickly emptied, the representatives departing as if they were schoolchildren rushing out at the sound of the final bell. One by one, they boarded their shuttles back to their respective motherships, intent on overseeing the mana stone exchange personally. After all, this exchange was the primary purpose of their journey, and ensuring that nothing went awry was of utmost importance to them all. The moment the last representative's shuttle departed from the hangar of the ship that had served as the meeting location, Calron acted swiftly. He initiated a mental network, pulling all the representatives of the Astral Conclave into a shared connection. His urgency was evident. He couldn't afford even a brief delay that might allow someone to initiate further communication with the Empire and potentially derail his plans. For this occasion, Calron set aside his usual sense of superiority, which would typically have seen him delegating such a task to one of his subordinates. Normally, he viewed the act of forming a mental network as beneath him, especially since it involved representatives from civilizations outside the Conclave's top 10, a group he considered far below his standing. However, the stakes were far too high for him to indulge his ego. Even the smallest, lowest-ranked civilization could shatter their advantage if they acted outside the coordinated effort. At this moment, practicality and urgency overrode his usual disdain, and he took direct control to ensure his intentions were executed without delay. This better have a good reason, or I won't let it slide, the Zorvak representative said, his voice carrying a calm but unmistakable edge of warning as he surveyed the round table within the mental network. The other representatives could feel the weight of his words, low and measured, but laced with the promise of consequences should the Zelvora's actions prove unnecessary. Though he could have easily resisted the pull into the network or severed his connection altogether, the Zorvak had chosen to comply, curious about the reasoning behind Calron's actions. However, his compliance did not equate to tolerance. His demeanor made it clear that if this intrusion turned out to be frivolous or driven by petty motives, there would be repercussions. For now, his curiosity held his retaliation in check, but his patience was thin. The other representatives who found themselves seated at the round table in the mental network reacted in a variety of ways. Those hailing from the top 10 civilizations wasted no time expressing their thoughts aloud, their tones ranging from mild curiosity to open irritation. Each of them sought to understand why they had been summoned so abruptly, particularly during such a critical time. Representatives from lower-ranked civilizations, however, adopted a more cautious approach. Some echoed the sentiments of their higher-ranked peers, while others kept their questions to themselves, wary of drawing unnecessary attention or seeming confrontational. They silently hoped the meeting would conclude quickly, eager to return to overseeing the coordination of the Mana Stones exchange, which was far more pressing to their interests. Calron, who had delayed his own entrance to ensure that no one was left out of the mental network, finally appeared in the roundtable meeting space. The room, which had been filled with whispered complaints and tension, immediately fell silent upon his arrival. His imposing presence, combined with the weight of the action he had just taken, demanded everyone's attention. I want to start by apologizing for pulling you all into my mental network so abruptly, he said, his tone serious. It was necessary and urgent. I hope we can move quickly through the meeting and reach an agreement, as I did not want to raise any suspicion. He glanced around the room, his expression making it clear that he was not joking. The situation was critical enough that he was willing to take the risk of others retaliating if they did not deem the matter important enough to warrant such an action. Keeping his promise, Calron wasted no time and got straight to the point. I know everyone here is fully aware that we're essentially getting mana stones for next to nothing, and I doubt any of us want that to change. However, we all understand this situation won't last. Once the Empire begins its initial integration efforts, they'll inevitably discover the true value of mana, he said, pausing briefly to observe the reactions of everyone in the room. Their expressions remained neutral, uninterested even, as everything he had said so far was common knowledge among them. But Calron wasn't reiterating these points for the sake of stating the obvious, he needed to ensure that everyone present was on the same page. It was crucial to eliminate even the slightest chance of misunderstanding, no matter how unlikely it seemed. Not wanting to waste more time or risk losing their attention, Calron quickly shifted to his main point. The reason I called this meeting is to propose a joint effort to delay this inevitability and ensure we can continue buying mana stones at these extremely low prices for as long as possible, and in the largest quantities possible. A brief silence fell over the room as everyone processed his words. Each representative appeared deep in thought, aligning Calron's proposal with their own interests and considerations before deciding how to respond. Don't you think Princess Serafina has already informed the Emperor about the actual value of mana stones? They could very well be observing us to see how we act, testing whether we assume they're ignorant, or if they allowed this specific exchange at the current rates simply because it was already agreed upon 6 months ago, the Valthoran representative remarked. His voice carried weight, highlighting the potential risks of Calron's suggestion. And what makes you so sure that the topic of adjusting the pricing wasn't already part of the agenda before you demanded we prioritize the Mana Stones exchange? What will you do if the Empire discovers our attempt to suppress this information and retaliates? Another representative immediately added. One by one, representatives from the various civilizations followed suit, voicing their concerns and pointing out flaws in Calron's proposed plan. Each raised probing questions, exposing potential vulnerabilities and risks that would come with attempting to manipulate the situation. The room filled with the sound of debate as they challenged the feasibility and consequences of the plan. Calron listened intently, mentally noting each question and concern raised. Once the representatives had finished voicing their doubts, he turned his attention to the Zorvak representative and asked, what was the actual price of mana before the discovery of the Empire? The Zorvak representative gave Calron a sharp glance, pausing for a moment before replying, I don't know the auction buying price. The only price I'm familiar with is what we pay for mana already acquired and owned by the Grand Zorvak government. But I'm assuming that's not the price you're asking for, is it? You are correct, Calron replied before following up, and why is it that way? The Zorvak representative raised an eyebrow, clearly questioning why Calron was asking such trivial questions. Still, he decided to indulge him and answered, because that is not my responsibility. It falls under the purview of a select group of Zorvak officials responsible for acquiring it for the Empire. They are supported by individuals from the civilizations under our protection. Upon hearing the answer, the representatives immediately understood the purpose of Calron's question. It indirectly addressed one of their concerns, that the Emperor might already know the true value of mana stones, possibly through Serafina. However, that worry was now dispelled. They realized that even within the Zorvak government, only a select few individuals were privy to the actual market price of mana stones purchased externally and then sold to the citizens. This insight reassured them that the likelihood of the Emperor having access to such detailed pricing information was minimal. That settles one concern, Calron said, following the Zorvak representative's response. As for whether the Empire knows the true worth of mana stones and plans to increase the price, we can use this meeting to agree on a unified position, a price increase we're willing to negotiate while ensuring it still remains lower than the pre-Empire discovery rates. He paused briefly, gauging the reactions in the mental network before continuing. As for the risk of the Empire uncovering our plans and retaliating, we can all take a mana oath to maintain strict confidentiality about this discussion. If, despite that, the Empire does find out and reacts negatively, we can collectively protest under the argument that this was a matter of self-interest. After all, the Empire willingly offered the initial price and agreed to the deal. They were not harmed in any way by our agreement since it was based on terms they themselves proposed. If they later become upset upon learning the true market value of mana stones, that's a result of their own failure to conduct proper market research, not our actions. By their own admission, the price they set was profitable for them at the time. Additionally, the scope of retaliation is limited, Calron continued, because they've sworn a mana oath and signed a mana contract to sell mana stones to us. That contract also includes our acknowledgement of them as allies of the Conclave. If they break that agreement, we'll have every right to break it as well. As Calron addressed their concerns and dismantled their worries, the representatives' expressions shifted. Their eyes lit up as they began to see the situation from a new perspective. They realized that this was, in essence, a win-win scenario. Either they could continue buying mana stones at cheap cost for the duration it took for the Empire to fully integrate into the Conclave, or, in the event the Empire retaliated and broke the agreement, it would nullify all existing contracts. That scenario would allow them to leverage the mana stones they had already acquired to send sufficient military forces to finally overpower the Empire. So, how do you suggest we proceed? The Ural Coalition representative asked. By setting up guardrails and limiting the ways the Empire can easily access this information once they send their initial fleets to the Astral Conclave's territory and attempt to initiate trade and other dealings. Even at their fastest, it'll take them several years to reach the populated areas of the Conclave, so we should have enough time to create measures that make it as difficult as possible for them to get hold of the information. Since we control the inter-civilization communication channels, we can also add a filtering layer to ensure that the Empire doesn't gain access to this information through the network. And since only government entities use this system, it should be fairly easy to implement, Calron replied. We can also create a problem within the Empire to force them to focus inwardly before they even consider focusing on us. This internal issue would be more urgent than anything else, possibly even destabilizing the Empire. For example, we can leverage our vast production capabilities to create goods and sell them at a cheaper price, or even at a loss, by using the free trade agreement we previously signed. This would prevent the Empire from stopping us, and over time, it would gradually cripple their production industry. Once their industry can't compete with the cheaper goods we sell, we can immediately raise prices. As for how we can sell things at a loss, we'll redirect a portion of the funds we previously spent on expensive mana stones to subsidize this plan. This will either delay the Empire from turning its focus on us, or it might even cause civil unrest. In that case, we can fan the flames further and support a faction to gain power, giving us the opportunity to control the star system without breaking the Mana Oath, the Ural Coalition representative suggested, outlining how they could use their large-scale production capabilities to disrupt the Empire while benefiting his coalition and having others fund the effort, accomplishing two goals with one move. If, despite all of that, the Empire still sends exploration fleets to the Conclave, we can create bureaucratic red tape for their fleets. Once they decide to send them, we can require them to go to a specific location in order to obtain the necessary permits to explore certain areas. This location would require them to take a few years just to get there. From there, we can add further delays in the approval process and other steps, buying us more time before they even make contact with the residents of the Conclave, the Alara representative suggested. One after another, the representatives of different civilizations began proposing their own ideas on how to extend the period in which the Empire remained unaware of the true value of mana stones. The suggestions grew more sinister, with some even recommending allowing pirates to attack the Empire's ships headed toward the Conclave, forcing the Empire to send replacements, thus delaying the process even further. However, it was the Shadari representative's suggestion that stood out as the most extreme. As he spoke, a chilling silence fell over the room, and everyone listening felt a sense of unease. Once enough time has passed, and if despite all our other attempts to destabilize the Empire not succeeding, by then we would have gained significant influence over them through selling products at a lower price, we can release this information to the Empire in a manner that will tarnish their image and destabilize the imperial government, putting their very stability at risk if they don't take immediate action to address the issue. This would force them to retaliate against us in order to prevent a civil war fueled by their civilians feeling humiliated and exploited. Once the Empire takes such drastic measures, we can escalate the situation, pushing them to a point where their actions would void the Mana Oath, giving us the opportunity to attack and seize control of the star system for ourselves, the Shadari representative proposed. Once nearly everyone in the room shared their suggestions, which indirectly showed their support for the plan and their willingness to agree to it if the final version benefited them, they began combining the ideas and fine-tuning the agreement. They quickly crafted an action plan outlining how they would jointly implement the strategy. It took about half an hour before the final version was ready. Calron, seeing the completed document, couldn't help but smile as his plan was inching closer to becoming a reality. He was about to speak, saying, "Now that the final document is here, let's move to vote," but before he could finish, he was interrupted by the Trinarian representative. Although the agreement is good and will be beneficial to all of us, the scale at which the Trinarians will benefit is small relative to the rest of you, said the Trinarian representative, a tone of hesitation in his voice. This makes it difficult for me to say this, but we cannot agree to the agreement in its current version. Calron raised an eyebrow, staring at the representative's statement. It felt like someone had suddenly thrown a stick into his bicycle wheel as he was speeding downhill, threatening to derail all his hard work. Even if everyone else in the room agreed to the terms and swore a mana oath to keep everything secret, the Trinarian representative would be excluded from that oath. This posed a huge risk, as the representative could easily reveal the plan to the Empire, rendering everything they had discussed nearly useless, and potentially drawing the Empire's retaliation toward their entire operation. What had been an opportunity for strategic planning might now backfire, causing more harm than if they had stuck with the previous status quo. From the look of it, the Trinarian representatives seemed to have planned for this moment from the very start, waiting patiently until the plan reached the voting stage. By then, all the information and strategy would have already been revealed, putting them in a highly leveraged position. This would force the others to compromise and accommodate his requests if they wanted the agreement and planned to remain secret in the first place. Caught between a rock and a hard place, Calron was left with little choice but to ask, "Please, let's hear the reason causing you to have reservations about voting for this agreement? Are you trying to use this agreement as a hostage to secure more benefits for yourself?" The Valthuran representative interjected before the Trinarian representative could respond to Calron's question. His tone was sharp, laced with frustration and suspicion. From his perspective, this agreement was a golden opportunity, one that could allow all of them to reap significant rewards. As the Valthuran representative, he was certain that if the agreement was finalized, his standing within his civilization would rise considerably. However, just as the deal was on the brink of becoming a reality, the Trinarian representative's sudden move felt like a calculated attempt to derail the entire process, fueling his visible frustration. "Why are you making assumptions without even listening to what I have to say first?" the Trinarian representative countered, redirecting his response to address the Valthuran representative's accusatory remark. "And why should I even bother hearing you out?" the Valthuran representative snapped, doubling down, "when this agreement clearly benefits everyone equally. This is about keeping the Empire from discovering the true value of mana stones. What part of it specifically makes it disproportionately advantageous to others while leaving you behind?" His pointed question elicited subtle nods of agreement from others within the mental network, as many shared his frustration. To them, it seemed absurd that someone might attempt to hold a mutually beneficial agreement hostage. "I agree as well, because if you can make that claim, then so can I," the Ural Coalition representative chimed in, seizing the moment. "I could just as easily argue that this agreement benefits others far more than it benefits us, and unless these so-called advantages are adjusted, I won't agree to this either. How would you feel if I said that?" His statement struck a chord, and it seemed to ignite a chain reaction. Many representatives saw this as an opportunity to pile on without fear of repercussion, emboldened by the near-unanimous dissatisfaction with the Trinarian representative's stance. The floodgates opened. Representatives began bad-mouthing the Trinarian representative, some taking it as a rare chance to criticize a member of the top 10 civilizations without fear of retaliation. Others saw it as leverage, using the chaos to push for additional concessions, arguing that the top 10 civilizations, who held the largest mana stone quotas, should offer something in return for the disproportionate benefits they stood to gain. The room descended into a chaotic mess, voices overlapping and tensions escalating as each representative sought to make their case heard. What had started as a structured discussion was now teetering on the brink of collapse. "First, let's Calron began, his voice laced with urgency as he attempted to salvage the meeting. He could see his carefully orchestrated plan slipping through his fingers. The stakes were far too high. None of the discussions in this room were yet protected by a mana oath. If the meeting ended without an agreement, any participant could decide to leak the details to the Empire in a bid to curry favor, and that would spell disaster, especially for him as the mastermind behind it all. But before Calron could even finish his sentence, a low, guttural growl echoed through the room. "GRLRR." The sound silenced the cacophony of voices instantly. Representatives froze mid-argument, their words swallowed by the weight of the sound. Those from the lesser civilizations turned pale, their gazes immediately darting toward the source of the noise. The Zorvak representative sat ominously at the far end of the massive oval table. His piercing gaze was locked on those seated opposite him, his nostrils flaring as a thin mist escaped with each exhale, a clear sign of his growing irritation. The tension in the room became palpable, the air thick with unease as everyone realized they had pushed the towering Zorvak to his limit. No one dared to speak. The representatives who had been shouting moments ago now sat motionless, their previous bravado replaced with silent fear and apprehension. Calron, seeing the opening created by the Zorvak representative's silent but powerful reprimand, knew he had to act quickly to restore order and salvage what was left of the meeting. Before Calron could say anything, the Zorvak representative's intense gaze shifted to the Trinarian representative, who had remained silent amidst the barrage of criticisms directed his way. With a single word, the Zorvak representative broke the silence. Speak. The command was simple but carried the weight of authority, leaving no room for defiance. Calron let out a subtle sigh of relief. The chaos had finally been subdued, though he wasn't entirely pleased with how it had happened. The control he had carefully maintained as the de facto leader of the meeting had been snatched away with just a single growl. The shift in authority stung his pride, but Calron knew better than to let his frustration show. This unexpected development, while unnerving, worked in his favor for now. Turning his attention to the Trinarian representative, Calron silently hoped that the representative had a valid and compelling reason for opposing the agreement in its current form. If the reason turned out to be frivolous or self-serving, Calron doubted he could salvage the situation. The meeting was already hanging by a thread, and another misstep could shatter any chance of reaching a consensus. What I was trying to say before everyone here started hurling insults at me, the Trinarian representative began, his tone pointed as he deliberately emphasized the behavior of the others. His gaze swept across the room, pausing on each individual who had participated in the barrage of insults, leaving them with a sinking feeling that his words carried a veiled warning. But before he could linger on his subtle threats, the Zorvak representative cut him off abruptly. Get to the point. I don't have more time to waste, he growled, his tone sharp and impatient, making it clear that his patience was wearing thin and that he would not tolerate any further delays or posturing. The room fell silent once again, the weight of the Zorvak representative's words pressing down on everyone. All eyes returned to the Trinarian representative, who now had no choice but to proceed without further dramatics. The Trinarian representative cleared his throat, trying to release the words that had been stuck in his chest, before diving straight into the matter at hand. Everything agreed upon here relies on the assumption that the Empire won't gain access to our wormhole and other spatial technologies locked within the encrypted knowledge vaults we've already shared with them. He paused, letting his words sink in as he allowed the cogs in the representatives' minds to begin turning. Because if the Empire does get their hands on it, they could bypass every obstacle we've set in place and directly enter our territory. With their access to mana stones, they could even do it repeatedly, bypassing anything we put in front of them. He took a moment, making sure everyone understood the gravity of the situation. As a result of our previous actions, the Empire retaliated by banning any discussion about increasing mana stone quotas from those who provided their knowledge after encrypting it, unless the decryption keys were handed over. Some of you are already planning to do this. He held up a hand for emphasis. But if we agree to this deal in its current form, we, the Trinarians, would be forbidden from providing the decryption keys to the Empire. That action would be seen as assisting the Empire in accessing the Conclave, which means our quotas will stay locked in place. Meanwhile, the rest of you would be free to negotiate higher quotas, benefiting from the very thing we'll be restricted from. The Trinarian representative leaned forward, his tone heavy with frustration. So, I ask, how am I supposed to justify agreeing to this deal to my government when we would be the biggest losers here, second only to the Empire? How does that work for us? FCK. That single word ran through the minds of the majority of the individuals present in the meeting room, especially those who had jumped at the chance to insult the Trinarian representative, believing he was merely holding the agreement hostage for personal gain and political leverage. Silence fell over the room like a heavy fog. No one dared to speak. A few of them internally wished the ground beneath them would open up and swallow them whole, though they knew such a miracle was impossible in the mental network. Instead, they sat frozen, the weight of their premature judgments now bearing down on them as they realized the Trinarian representative had, in fact, raised a valid and critical point. A small smile crept across Calron's face, pleased not only that the Trinarian representative had a solid reason for his hesitation but also because the room's silence presented him with an opportunity to reclaim his position as the de facto leader of the meeting. He cleared his throat deliberately, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. Your concerns are indeed valid, and it does appear that you'd be left with the short end of the stick, he began, his voice measured and calm. Thankfully, I have a recommendation to address this issue. He paused briefly, letting anticipation build in the room. As the representatives turned their focus to him, some with curiosity and others with hopeful expressions, he decided not to drag it out further. How about we add an additional clause to the agreement, he proposed, that entitles the Trinarians to 5% of any increased mana stone quotas. The murmurs began, but Calron pressed on. This, in my view, is a fair compromise. Your civilization would also benefit directly from the increased quotas, and the amount would grow as the quotas continue to rise. Naturally, the civilization surrendering a portion of their allocated quota would shoulder the cost of this adjustment. To ensure fairness, the Trinarians would purchase this 5% share at 10 times the price we currently pay the Empire, serving as compensation for the sacrifices made by the other parties. He leaned back slightly, gauging the reactions of the room. The offer was structured enough to appear generous while subtly increasing the complexity of opposition, a hallmark of Calron's strategic mind. Upon hearing Calron's suggestion, the reactions across the room were mixed. A few representatives nodded in agreement, others frowned, but the majority remained silent, carefully calculating whether this adjustment would benefit or harm their positions. The Trinarian representative, however, stayed quiet. His expression betrayed only a faint hint of satisfaction, a subtle change so minute that it could have been easily misinterpreted. If they are receiving 5%, then what about us? The Ural Coalition representative argued, breaking the silence. We, too, provided encrypted data to the Empire. Shouldn't we also be guaranteed the same privileges? His words quickly garnered murmurs of agreement from other representatives who had also given the Empire encrypted knowledge. Sensing an opportunity, a few began preparing to press this angle and leverage the situation to gain similar concessions. Before the room could descend into another chaotic debate, the Valthoran representative abruptly interjected, his tone laced with displeasure. You giving the Empire the decryption keys isn't going to harm the current agreement or reveal the actual price of mana stones, so I think it's irrelevant to this discussion. Don't you agree? The Valthoran representative stated, clearly unwilling to let others capitalize on something immaterial to the proposed agreement. His stance wasn't just about the agreement itself, it was also driven by the desire to avoid any form of indirect punishment for his civilization, which had provided their knowledge to the Empire openly without encryption or manipulation. Instead of a direct response from the Ural Coalition representative, murmurs of agreement echoed through the mental network as others sided with the Valthoran representative's reasoning. With the room now seemingly united on this point, any representatives who had initially hoped to leverage their encrypted data fell silent. The Ural Coalition representative, seeing the overwhelming opposition, decided to let it go. At least I tried, he thought, reluctantly backing down. While he had hoped to secure more benefits, the realization dawned on him that pushing the matter further might jeopardize the entire agreement. And despite his ambitions, he understood that keeping the price of mana stones low remained the primary goal, everything else was secondary. But 5% is too high, and although our mana quotas vary, if we follow that suggestion, the Trinarians will be receiving 245% of the average of our mana quotas, which is quite unfair to the rest of us, a representative from one of the lower-tier civilizations pointed out, steering the conversation back to the contentious Trinarian proposal. Calron sighed internally, sensing yet another hurdle in securing the agreement. Maintaining a composed demeanor, he explained, the 5% is not from your entire mana quota but only from the increase in your quota. For instance, if your original quota was 10 and negotiations result in your total quota increasing to 15, only 5% of the increase, that additional 5, will be allocated to the Trinarians. They will not benefit from the base quota, only the increase. I believe this is a fair compromise. He deliberately simplified the explanation, using clear examples to avoid misunderstandings, despite knowing that all the representatives were intelligent enough to grasp the concept. If that's the case, the Farron representative interjected, why not reduce it to 2% under the same rules? With 50 civilizations here, 49 if we exclude the Trinarians, each contributing 2% of their increased quota would still amount to 98% of the average increase. That seems far more equitable. His suggestion was met with a sharp glance from the Trinarian representative, who didn't appreciate the attempt to cut the allocation. However, the Farron representative paid no heed, firmly focused on minimizing the cost to his own civilization. After all, every representative in the room was here to serve their own people's interests, and shaving down the Mana Stone concessions was his way of doing just that. This was diplomacy. After all, negotiation was the heart of the game. A murmur rippled through the room as representatives weighed the fairness of the reduced percentage against the practicality of finalizing the deal. I'd like to remind the Ural Coalition representative that we, the Trinarians, are ranked within the top 5 civilizations in the conclave, the Trinarian representative stated, his gaze sharp as it met the Ural Coalition representatives. While we may not know each other's exact quotas, I believe it's safe to say our allocations are reflective of our standing. Receiving the average of the increased quotas might seem significant, but it is relative to each civilization's level and their prior quota. I am certain that, for us, this average would fall short of what we could achieve if we handed the decryption keys over to the Empire. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in, before continuing. Even if we were to accept the 5% and, as some have suggested, it translates to 245% of the average of the increased quota, it would still be less than what we would gain under normal circumstances. However, since this agreement demands shared sacrifices for the benefit of the whole, we will agree to the 5%, on the condition that additional concessions are made by your civilizations to cover the remainder of our potential loss. His words were firm yet diplomatic, leaving little room for counter-arguments as he turned his attention toward Calron to take the lead. Calron, sensing the precarious tension in the room, acted swiftly to avert another descent into chaos. He immediately began emphasizing the positive aspects of the agreement. A 5% loss from the increased quota is a minor trade-off, he stressed, but his voice was calm. Compared to the enormous losses we'd all incur if forced to purchase mana stones at their original price, this agreement is far more advantageous. Let's not lose sight of the larger picture here. This is about long-term stability and collective strength. What followed, however, was a tangled mess of debate. Some representatives pushed to lower the percentage, proposing alternative concessions to offset the loss. Others, while agreeing to the 5%, argued that the Trinarians should purchase their share at the true price of mana stones instead of the previously discussed tenfold increase from the Empire's base price. This suggestion sparked immediate rejection from the Trinarian representative, who retorted, if have to pay the true price anyway, we might as well buy directly from the Empire, making all these discussions meaningless for us. The back and forth persisted, with tempers flaring and points being debated, countered, and re-evaluated. For 5 tense minutes, arguments bounced across the room as factions sought to protect their interests while still trying to keep the agreement intact. Calron, acting as a stabilizing force, mediated where he could, ensuring the discussion didn't spiral out of control. Eventually, a compromise was reached that represented the least loss for all parties involved. The 5% share from the increased quotas would remain unchanged, but the Trinarians would purchase this share at a 2,000% price increase from the Empire's base price, rather than the tenfold increase initially proposed. Additionally, the Trinarians would receive one basic level concession from each civilization present, offering them additional benefits to offset their potential losses. The agreement, though far from perfect, was one that all parties could reluctantly accept and was immediately put to a vote. Unsurprisingly, it passed unanimously, followed by everyone swearing a mana oath to keep the details of the meeting and everything discussed secret from the Empire and any irrelevant individuals. So, how are we going to give the mana stones to the Trinarian without breaking the mana oath we swore in the mana contract we signed with the Empire? There is nothing in the contract that says if our ship carrying mana stones is attacked, we are going to be punished, as that falls under circumstances beyond our control, Calron said, subtly hinting at how they could proceed. The mana oath and mana contract were intentionally vague in certain areas, particularly regarding what constituted a breach. This vagueness allowed loopholes like this to exist, and if they executed their plan perfectly, they could avoid any repercussions. All right, let's hurry back. More than half an hour has already passed, and if we delay for more than an hour, the Empire is going to suspect something, Calron said before delivering his closing remarks, officially ending the meeting and disconnecting everyone from the mental network. As the representatives returned to their physical selves, they found themselves in the hangars of their motherships, where they had arrived some time ago. Without wasting a moment, they immediately began preparations for the handover while simultaneously reporting back to the relevant authorities within their governments about the agreement and its terms. As representatives, they had the authority to finalize agreements like this. Their only obligation was to report back as soon as it was feasible. One by one, they began contacting Lanesra at different, random intervals over the next hour, informing her that their preparations were complete and that they were ready for the exchange to proceed. Lanesra could be seen standing in the control room, her gaze fixed on the hologram in front of her. The display detailed every aspect of the ongoing exchange, which had begun a few minutes earlier. "It feels like we're Japan," she said, her eyes never leaving the hologram. "I'm sorry, but I don't quite understand what you mean," came a response from someone approaching her. Without looking, Lanesra immediately recognized the voice and replied as if it were a routine exchange. "Ah, I was referring to a similar situation that happened in late 16th and early 17th century Japan during the end of the Sengoku period and the Tokugawa shogunate. Back then, Japan traded its precious silver and gold for textiles and other goods that were sold at exorbitant markups." "Aha, I see now," the man said, nodding as he grasped her point. "But that comparison would only hold true if we were actually mining the mana stones ourselves." "True, but it still leaves a bad taste in my mouth," Lanesra said, finally turning to face the man she had been conversing with. She added, "Once this is done and we return to continue the meeting, you'll be coming with me as well." "Are you sure you want them to know about our existence?" he asked, clearly surprised by her decision. "It really doesn't make much difference," she replied calmly. "It's not like we've been actively hiding the fact that elves and others exist. Once the trading hub is fully constructed and commerce starts flowing through it, they're going to find out about you anyway. We've never made an effort to conceal your presence, we just didn't go out of our way to announce it." Her eyes briefly lingered on him, the elf who served as the second in command of the Mana Agency. He was one of many who had chosen to migrate to Earth after the policy allowing direct mixing between species had been enacted a few years earlier. Aragon chuckled at her explanation, then nodded. "Fine, I'll be on my best behavior," he said, his tone lighthearted. His response earned a soft chuckle from Lanesra before she turned her attention back to the hologram, her focus once again on monitoring the ongoing exchange. The exchange of goods took the better part of the day to complete. The sheer volume of materials required meticulous inspection for quality, quantity, and safety before they could be securely stored and accounted for. Lanesra immediately ordered the Imperial cargo ships, now loaded with the exchanged materials, to head back to the solar system. A massive operation awaited their return, analyzing and logging everything into the Akashic record, making it instantly accessible to researchers in the Empire's research city and anyone else via VR. This approach would allow the Empire to gather immense amounts of data by observing how researchers and citizens experimented with these materials in a controlled VR environment. Meanwhile, the research city and Imperial labs would focus their efforts on the most promising results, prioritizing areas deemed worthy of further exploration. Accompanying the returning Imperial ships was a small group of foreign vessels. These carried the remaining Zorvak members of Serafina's faction, who had chosen to join her in the Empire. Once everything was set in motion, Lanesra and Aragon disembarked from the mothership and headed to the designated meeting location aboard another vessel to resume their previous discussions. "Sir, the materials exchange has been completed, and the cargo ships are on their way back. Should I deliver the materials Princess Serafina needs for her growth now, or would you prefer to handle it yourself?" Nova inquired, as she observed Aaron, who was intently monitoring the progress of his research. "That was quick," Aaron remarked, his voice laced with surprise. "I thought the meeting would last longer, at least a few days." "No, the meeting was paused for the exchange as requested by the representatives. They're now resuming it after a one-day break for the exchange to occur," Nova explained, updating him on how the exchange had taken place sooner than expected. "Makes sense," Aaron said, a small smile tugging at his lips. "They've finally accepted our opium. This is more addictive than opium, sir," Nova replied. She too was also happy as things were going as planned. Send her half of what we got for her, and send the rest for deep scanning. We need to try replicating them and if possible making them more effective, Aaron instructed, responding to her first question. He then returned his focus to monitoring his ongoing research. Yes, sir, Nova responded, falling silent as she joined him in observing the research. With the mana stones exchanged, only the meeting remained. The endurance of those present allowed discussions to continue for over 16 hours, wrapping things up sooner than expected. This early finish meant the individual meetings about increasing their mana stone quotas could start and wrap up ahead of schedule. During the individual meetings between the Empire and the representatives, those who had shared their knowledge in encrypted form eventually handed over the decryption keys. The realization that their mana stone quotas would rise by at least 200%, and potentially soar to 500% based on the materials they proposed for exchange, made the decision inevitable. It was an offer they couldn't afford to turn down. Some had initially planned to hold out and assess the potential increase before making a decision, but the sheer scale of the opportunity left no room for second thoughts. Fearing the Empire might reconsider its offer, they immediately agreed to hand over the decryption keys without delay. Although their primary reason for being here was fulfilled, the Conclave Civilizations representatives didn't leave immediately. They had requested access to the exchange forum, which was already operational, even though its physical counterpart in the real world was still under construction. Now, they were in the midst of a shopping spree, using their remaining materials to buy everything they could. The Empire didn't interfere, as the representatives only had access to the business portal, where all listed items had already been approved before being made available. Meanwhile, Hephaestus Industries immediately began production on all the purchased materials, regardless of their original manufacturers on Earth. The Empire needed to ensure that everything sold to outsiders passed through a strict filtering process, preventing potential issues if any previously unknown factors were discovered. In return, all of the original owners of the purchased products were given the original profit of their product as if it was bought from them. However, if their product was sold for a price significantly higher than its original value, the compensation shifted to a revenue-sharing model. The original price served as the benchmark, and the profit percentage was used to determine how much they would earn from the increased sale. This approach was designed to avoid incentivizing the formation of a black market should the company attempt to use this as a means of earning more money. At the same time, Hephaestus Industries' share was capped at twice the actual production cost of the product. All remaining revenue was collected as taxes and sent to the imperial coffers, ensuring there were no accusations that the emperor was exploiting others' products for personal gain. Not that it mattered much. At this point, the emperor was already the wealthiest person in history, with more money than he could ever spend, even if he tried. Sir, we finally received the decryption keys for all but one of the encrypted knowledge files, Nova informed Aaron the moment she had the keys in hand. Which one didn't fall for the offer? Aaron asked, genuinely surprised. He hadn't expected anyone to resist the temptation of at least doubling their quota. The Trinarian representative, sir. His brows lifted in surprise at the response. The Trinarian's knowledge was one of the technologies he'd been most eager to acquire, and now he found himself puzzling over why they alone had held out. But he didn't dwell on it for long. Decrypt all the files we have the keys for, he said decisively. Then redirect all the computing power we were using for decryption attempts toward cracking the Trinarian's knowledge. If, after a month of focused effort, we still can't break it, I'll use SP to buy the decryption tech for it. Understood, Nova replied, wasting no time as she set to work. Aaron, on the other hand, went back to what he had been doing, though his demeanor had shifted ever so slightly. A quiet excitement seemed to radiate from him now. He could hardly wait to finally lay his hands on the newly decrypted tech and knowledge. He knew it would be the key to fleshing out his own technology and advancing his plans. Wouldn't the increase in quota let them stockpile mana stones or even drive their value down further? Aragon found himself asking Lanesra as they traveled back to Earth. Though they had been the ones to implement the increase in the representatives' quotas, they were merely carrying out the Emperor's orders. While they could have asked for the reasoning behind the decision, Lanesra hadn't yet had the chance to meet with the Emperor to seek clarification. The order had come just weeks before the trade was set to take place, leaving no time to request a meeting or fully understand the strategy behind it. But despite not having all the answers, she had a theory. I think the Emperor is trying to deepen their reliance on mana stones to the point where they'll have no choice but to depend entirely on us, Lanesra said. Aren't we already doing that by selling mana stones cheaply while pretending we don't know their true value? Aragon asked, wondering if pushing further was unnecessary, or even redundant, to their existing strategy. The pricing might just be one piece of a much larger plan, Lanesra explained. The initial quota was set at about 1.5 times each civilization's usual mana expenditure. While the price itself was far cheaper than what they were used to paying, the amount of mana stones traded still left them with the option to fall back on their previous sources without any major disruption to their day-to-day operations, other than having to spend more money, if something happened to cut off their access to Earth's mana stones. If that were the only factor, our price leverage would only go so far. But by tripling their quota, we trigger the Jevons paradox, where increasing efficiency or lowering the cost of a resource leads to even greater consumption. Mana, which was once used sparingly due to its high cost and limited supply, will now be used more widely. New applications for mana will emerge, driving up demand even further. This cycle will repeat until they reach a point where they can't function effectively without it. Take wormhole technology, for example. Before, they reserved it for emergencies or wartime. But now, with mana stones more accessible and affordable, they could start using them for trade, moving critical materials that once took years to transport. Similar shifts will happen across the board, tying them even more tightly to mana, and to us. Her explanation sent Aragon into a nodding spree, his expression one of dawning understanding. It wasn't just clarity he felt, though. His awe for the Emperor grew, along with a newfound appreciation for the meticulousness of the man's planning. Noticing the contemplative look on Aragon's face, Lanesra added, "At least, that's what I think the reasoning behind the Emperor's orders might be. It's all speculation at this point. We'll know the truth once we ask him directly during our upcoming meeting." She wanted to make sure Aragon understood that her thoughts were just that, thoughts, and not the official stance of the Empire or the Emperor, which could turn out to be entirely different. "Sir, the decryption is complete," Nova informed Aaron a few hours after receiving the decryption keys. "That was fast," Aaron remarked, surprised by the speed. Previously, when processing the unencrypted information, it had taken considerably longer. "The groundwork was already laid when I accessed the unencrypted knowledge," Nova explained. "This time, all I had to do was decrypt it and run it through the algorithm, which handled the rest." MHH. Aaron nodded in acknowledgement before adding, "Let's hold off on assimilating the knowledge until they leave, just in case. Send the information to the Lab City researchers and have them work on incorporating any beneficial aspects." He restrained his excitement, opting to be cautious in case their visitors had ulterior motives. "Understood," Nova confirmed. Upon receiving her response, Aaron returned to his research. For the next week, the purchased goods were continuously delivered to the ships of the Astral Conclave representatives, while in return, they handed over the materials exchanged for those products. Once the exchange was completed, they wasted no time in opening their wormholes and returning home, marking the conclusion of the first official trade between the two sides. "Finally, they've left," Aaron muttered as he watched the projection of the solar system. The display slowly filled with a red overlay, indicating the reactivation of the military's spatial locks hidden within the Oort cloud. These locks had been deactivated and placed into active stealth about a month before the agreed meeting date. The Empire was now officially sealed off from all Tier 1 and lower spatial technology. "Let's start the assimilations then," Aaron said the moment the entire projection turned red. Without wasting any time, he initiated the logout procedure, knowing that Nova would put him into a deep sleep for the process. This time, he planned to assimilate all the remaining knowledge, leaving only one piece that was still encrypted, the Trinarian knowledge. As Aaron began the logout sequence, Nova activated the standard protocol she always used whenever he was expected to be out of commission for an extended period. A week later. "How long do you think it will take?" Aaron asked, his gaze fixed on John, who sat across from him, listening intently. John took a moment to gather his thoughts before responding. The biggest issue is the lack of critical information about the other side, which makes it impossible to give a precise timeline. Given how long they've existed, how fragile their peace is, and the fact that anyone can declare war under specific conditions, it's clear that all of them are maintaining active militaries with no signs of downsizing. Based on that, I'd estimate at least 10 years, if we operate at maximum production capacity. Does the assessment include the previously decrypted technologies? Aaron asked. Not entirely, John admitted. The scope of knowledge is too vast for us to develop implementation strategies in such a short time. Depending on how we learn to exploit these technologies to our advantage, the timeline could be significantly reduced. That's why I request at least 6 months to thoroughly analyze the knowledge and allow the researchers to uncover as many applicable technologies as possible before we commit to large-scale production. This period will also give us time to restructure the military to align with the plan. I'll give you a year and a quantum supercluster running at maximum time acceleration, Aaron stated, fully committing to his plan. You'll report to me with updates once a month on the project's progress. Will that be enough to ensure our preparations are so thorough that it won't matter what the other side has? Although there's no such thing as absolute certainty, this period should give us enough time to get as close to perfection as possible, John replied, his voice filled with conviction. He was confident that, with the resources provided, they could minimize any risks and prepare for whatever came their way. Good. And how are we doing with the preparations for intelligence gathering operations? He asked, moving on to the next topic, now that the previous one was settled. The preparations for that have also been paused for now. We're currently looking into the available Shadari knowledge to see if it can benefit our operations. It will also be included in the research during the period you've given us. Their knowledge is promising enough to be a game changer if used alongside our stealth technology. Taking into account how long it will take to have them spread throughout the conclave, we need to ensure they are as prepared as possible. The first batch will be operating with almost no backup, so we've came to the conclusion that they need to be as ready as possible, John replied. Aaron nodded as he listened to John's explanation. Though he had something he could add, he decided against it for now. He planned to wait until he had access to the Trinarian technology, knowing that it was not only a game changer but also the spearhead for initiating all the plans. After spending 2 more hours discussing with John, the meeting finally came to an end. John left the room, leaving Aaron alone to process the information and reflect on the next steps. What is our progress on the decryption of the Trinarian knowledge? Aaron asked. I've tried using encryption technologies from other civilizations as a reference, but it seems the Trinarian tech is vastly different. At the moment, progress is slow. Nova responded, materializing and taking the seat where John had been sitting. Upon receiving Nova's response, Aaron took a moment to consider his options, wondering whether to wait the remaining 2 weeks or use the system shop to buy a solution for decrypting the technology. I suggest we wait for the remaining 2-week period. While we may not decrypt it immediately, the knowledge we gain during that time will still be valuable. Plus, you should use this time to rest. You haven't taken any breaks since the trade, and that's not good. Nova said, noticing the look of contemplation on his face. Yeah, let's do that, Aaron agreed, rubbing his face with his hands before beginning the logout procedure. He hoped Nova would manage to crack the encryption within the time, as the thought of how much it would cost to purchase the decryption technology was enough to make him not want to think about it. Oh, this is quite delicious. Did Nova prepare this? Aaron asked with a smirk as he tasted the food. He was sitting in an open field that looked more like a picnic spot than a meeting ground. Before he could even swallow, he had to tilt his head to the side to dodge a fireball flying straight at him. Don't you know you shouldn't even disturb a dog while it's eating? He said with a laugh, glancing at his wife, who had just attempted to give him an impromptu facial makeover. You were asking for it, Rena replied casually as she poured mango juice into their glasses, his favorite. Nevertheless, it's delicious, Aaron said, setting aside his joke as he genuinely complimented her cooking. It wasn't something she did often, mostly because she didn't need to, but he appreciated it all the same. He took the glass of mango juice from her with a nod of thanks. It was why they had made it a tradition for them to have these picnics at least once every few months, where they handled everything themselves, from preparation and cooking to cleaning, without relying on technology or workers. It was just one of the many types of dates they made sure to do at least once a month. Of course, this also meant she had to learn how to cook the conventional way, which had led to their enhanced metabolism coming in handy more than a few times in the early days of these picnic-style dates. Rena smirked as she took a sip of her own juice, watching Aaron enjoy the meal. I'm assuming it's safe to say I've improved. Aaron chuckled, nodding as he took another bite. I'd say we've moved past the survival training phase, yeah. She rolled her eyes but laughed along with him. Well, if you hadn't insisted on doing this without any AI assistance or knowledge assimilation, maybe we wouldn't have needed that survival training in the first place. That's the whole point, isn't it? Aaron said, stretching his legs out on the grass. For once, no tech, no empire, just us, and maybe a few near-death experiences from your early cooking. Rena gasped dramatically. You did not just say that. Aaron grinned, raising his glass. To progress. She huffed, but clinked her glass against his. To progress. After spending quite a while enjoying their meal and light-hearted conversation, they eventually moved on to other picnic activities. However, given the sheer level of power their bodies now possessed, what would typically be considered casual games turned into an outright spectacle. Every activity had to be modified to accommodate their strength. Simple games of catch became high-speed projectile dodging, tug-of-war turned into a battle of finely controlled force, and even something as simple as racing across the open field created shockwaves in their wake. Yet, rather than being disruptive, it made everything even more exhilarating. The challenge of holding back just enough to keep things fun, while still pushing each other in ways only they could, added a layer of excitement that no ordinary game could match. For more than 3 hours, they played without pause, their endless stamina and rapid recovery ensuring they never had to slow down. Laughter echoed across the field as they kept pushing the limits of what should have been a simple, peaceful picnic, yet for them, this was exactly the kind of break they needed. As they walked back to where their belongings were placed, the only sign of their hours of intense activity was the rhythmic rise and fall of their chests. How's your research going? Aaron asked, glancing at Rena. There's progress, but nothing substantial yet, she admitted, taking the water bottle he had opened for her. It feels like we're stuck looking at it from the same perspective we already know. I think we need to find a new angle that should help us understand it better. Aaron nodded as he considered her words. We've managed to decrypt most of the knowledge from the conclave civilizations. Some of them use magic in ways completely different from us. Some focus on strengthening their bodies, while others have developed magic engineering. That might give you some new perspectives. What do you think? Rena didn't answer immediately, still drinking her water. When she was done, she handed the bottle back to Aaron, who took a sip before she finally responded. That actually sounds really useful. It might even spark some new ideas. Thanks. Then, tilting her head slightly, she asked, how's your research coming along? Aaron let out a satisfied sigh after quenching his thirst. It's been going well. With all the new knowledge we've gained, my mind's been flooded with ideas. But since I'm stuck on this forced rest period, all I can do is document them for when the 2 weeks are up, he said as they lay down together. He reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers. Not that I'm complaining, he added with a smirk before leaning in to kiss her. Rena chuckled softly at his words, squeezing his hand. You really are hopeless when it comes to resting, she teased, tilting her head to look at him. Aaron smirked. Says the one who once spent 3 straight days refining a single magic cycle because she almost had it. She huffed, nudging him playfully. That was different. I was onto something. And I'm not. He shot back, raising an eyebrow. She laughed at that, shaking her head. Fine, fine. I guess we both have a problem. They fell into a comfortable silence, watching the sky deepen into twilight as the night settled around them. The first stars began to pierce through the fading light, their glow steady and serene. A cool breeze drifted past, carrying the distant hum of nature, adding to the quiet intimacy of the moment. Despite the intensity of their earlier activities, everything now felt calm, almost weightless, as if the world had slowed just for them. You know, Rena eventually said, her voice quieter now, these moments, they remind me why we push so hard. It's not just about power or progress, it's about making sure we still get to have things like this. Time, freedom, each other. Aaron turned his head to look at her, his expression softening. Yeah, he agreed, his grip on her hand tightening slightly. That's why we have to be prepared. She nodded, then smirked. But first, we have to survive 2 weeks of you trying not to sneak off and work. Aaron groaned, rolling onto his back dramatically. Easier said than done. Rena laughed, resting her head on his shoulder. I'll make sure you don't.